What if I told you that one soldier, armed with nothing but a rifle and unshakable determination, single-handedly prevented an entire battalion from surrendering to the enemy? What if I told you that this same soldier was someone everyone had written off as just another farm boy from Nebraska who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn? The morning of October 15th, 1944, started like any other in the dense forests of eastern France. The 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment had been pinned down for 3 grueling days, their ammunition running dangerously low. Their morale shattered like glass under the relentless German artillery barrage. Colonel Marcus Richardson knew his men were at their breaking point. The decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life was just minutes away from being made. But before we get to that moment that changed everything, let me tell you about Private First Class Tommy Sullivan, a 22-year-old kid from Omaha who had never fired a shot in anger before shipping out to Europe 6 months earlier. Tommy wasn't the kind of soldier you'd pick to save the day. He was quiet, kept to himself, and had a habit of missing easy shots during training that made his drill sergeants shake their heads in frustration. His fellow soldiers had nicknamed him Lucky as a cruel joke, because luck seemed to be the only way he ever hit anything. What they didn't know about Tommy Sullivan was that he had been hunting white-tailed deer in the Nebraska countryside since he was 8 years old. What they couldn't see was the way his grandfather had taught him to read the wind, to feel the rhythm of his own heartbeat, to become one with his rifle in those quiet moments before dawn broke over the cornfields. The Army's shooting range was nothing like the rolling hills of home, where a missed shot meant going hungry, where patience wasn't just a virtue, but a necessity for survival. The German forces had them surrounded on 3 sides, with the Vosges Mountains at their backs, offering no escape route. Captain James Morrison, Tommy's company commander, had been wounded the previous day when a mortar shell exploded just 20 feet from his foxhole. Shrapnel had torn through his left shoulder, but he refused evacuation, knowing his men needed experienced leadership now more than ever. What he didn't realize was that experience sometimes meant knowing when to give up. Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. The Germans had positioned their command post in an old stone church tower exactly 847 yards from the American position. For 3 days, their officers had been coordinating attacks from that tower with impunity, knowing that none of the American weapons could reach them effectively at that distance. They were right about everything, except one thing they had no way of knowing: Tommy Sullivan could make shots that would seem impossible to anyone who hadn't grown up tracking wounded elk through 3 miles of Nebraska wilderness. VBI surrender order came down from Colonel Richardson at exactly 0630 hours. He had made the impossible calculation that every commander dreads, weighing the lives of his remaining 230 men against the slim chance of a miracle. The white flag was already being prepared when Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, a tough-as-nails veteran from El Paso, Texas, noticed something that everyone else had missed. Rodriguez had been watching the German tower through her binoculars when she spotted the flash of sunlight reflecting off the German colonel's field glasses. She had served in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, and she knew an opportunity when she saw one. But more importantly, she had been watching Tommy Sullivan for months, noticing things that others overlooked. She had seen him quietly cleaning his rifle every morning, with the kind of devotion most men reserved for prayer. She had watched him studying the landscape with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than military training. Tommy was sitting in his foxhole, methodically checking his Springfield rifle for what he thought might be the last time, when Rodriguez crawled over to him through the mud and fallen leaves. The conversation they had in those next few minutes would echo through military history, though neither of them knew it at the time. Rodriguez asked him a simple question that would change everything. "Do you think you can make that shot?" Tommy looked up at the church tower, squinting against the morning sun that was just beginning to burn through the fog. He thought about his grandfather's weathered hands, teaching him to adjust for wind drift, about the way sound travels differently through cold air, about the patience required to wait for that perfect moment when everything aligns. 847 yards was further than anything he had attempted in combat, but it wasn't the distance that worried him. It was the weight of 230 lives resting on his shoulders. The German colonel in the tower was SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Zimmermann, a decorated veteran who had earned his reputation during the brutal fighting in Stalingrad. Zimmermann had been coordinating the encirclement of American forces with the cold precision of a chess master, moving his pieces into position for what he believed would be the final checkmate. His confidence was absolute. He had done this before in Russia, in Yugoslavia, in Italy. American units always broke when the pressure became too much to bear. What Zimmermann couldn't have anticipated was that his habit of appearing at the tower window at precisely the same time each morning to survey the battlefield through his binoculars would become his greatest vulnerability. Routine was both a strength and weakness in warfare, providing predictability for your own forces while potentially offering patterns for your enemies to exploit. Tommy spent the next 15 minutes studying everything he could observe about the shot. The wind was coming from the northwest at approximately 12 miles per hour, with gusts that made the tree branches dance in irregular patterns. The temperature was hovering just above freezing, which would affect the trajectory of the bullet over such a long distance. Most critically, he had to account for the fact that his target would only be visible for a few seconds at most. Rodriguez had convinced Captain Morrison to delay the surrender order for 30 minutes, though she hadn't told him why. Morrison was in no condition to argue, his shoulder wound sapping his strength and his judgment clouded by pain medication. The captain simply nodded and closed his eyes, perhaps hoping that when he opened them again, this nightmare would be over. The other soldiers in Tommy's squad watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as he began making his preparations. Private Danny Chen from San Francisco had been sharing a foxhole with Tommy for 3 months, but he had never seen this level of focused intensity from the quiet farm boy. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a Boston native who had survived the landing at Omaha Beach, muttered something under his breath about desperate times calling for desperate measures. Tommy loaded a single round into his rifle, the metallic click seeming unnaturally loud in the relative quiet of the early morning. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, when everything hangs in the balance, you don't get a second chance. One shot, one opportunity, one moment to prove that all those years of practice in the Nebraska wilderness had prepared him for something bigger than anyone had ever imagined. At exactly 0700 hours, just as Rodriguez had predicted, the German colonel appeared at the tower window. Zimmermann raised his binoculars to scan the American positions, confident in his tactical superiority and completely unaware that he had just stepped into the crosshairs of history. Tommy controlled his breathing, feeling his heartbeat slow to a steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with some deeper current of fate. The mathematics of the shot were staggering. At 847 yards, Tommy had to account for a bullet drop of approximately 6 feet, meaning he needed to aim well above his target. The crosswind would push the bullet nearly 2 feet to the left during its flight time of just over 1 second. The angle of elevation added another layer of complexity as the church tower stood roughly 40 feet above the American position. But Tommy wasn't thinking about mathematics in that moment. He was thinking about the way his grandfather had taught him to become part of the landscape, to feel the rhythm of the natural world and trust in something beyond conscious calculation. His finger found the trigger, applying the steady pressure that had become as natural as breathing during countless hunts in the rolling hills of home. The sharp crack of the Springfield rifle echoed across the battlefield like thunder, breaking the early morning silence with its unmistakable authority. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody dared to hope that the impossible had just become reality. Then Rodriguez, still watching through her binoculars, let out a whoop that could be heard across half the battlefield. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Zimmermann, the decorated veteran who had terrorized Allied forces across 3 continents, dropped his binoculars and collapsed backward into the church tower. The bullet had found its mark with surgical precision, striking him in the chest and ending his command of the encirclement in an instant. The German coordination that had seemed so methodical and inevitable just moments before began to unravel like a thread pulled from a sweater. What happened next was something that Tommy Sullivan would never fully understand, though military historians would spend decades analyzing the psychological impact of his single shot. The German forces, who had been pressing their attack with confidence just minutes before, suddenly found themselves without their most experienced field commander. The junior officers who stepped up to fill the void lacked Zimmermann's tactical brilliance, and more importantly, his iron confidence in the inevitability of American surrender. The change in momentum was immediate and dramatic. Captain Morrison, despite his wounds, rallied his men with an energy that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical limitations. The soldiers who had been preparing to surrender just minutes before now found themselves with renewed purpose, their rifles singing a different tune as they began to push back against the German positions. Rodriguez coordinated the counterattack with the kind of tactical brilliance that had earned her 3 battlefield promotions, but she knew that none of it would have been possible without Tommy's impossible shot. The kid from Nebraska had done more than eliminate an enemy commander. He had changed the entire psychology of the battlefield, transforming defeat into possibility with a single squeeze of his trigger finger. The fighting continued for 6 more hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The German forces, demoralized by the loss of their commander and facing an American unit that refused to break, began a fighting withdrawal that would eventually take them back across the German border. By the end of the day, the 3rd Battalion had not only avoided surrender, but had advanced nearly 2 miles into German-held territory. Tommy Sullivan was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day, though he never felt comfortable with the attention that followed. He continued to serve with distinction through the remainder of the war, participating in the crossing of the Rhine and the final push into Germany. But he never forgot the weight of that moment when 230 lives hung in the balance, and he never stopped marveling at how a kid from Omaha had somehow found himself at the center of history. After the war, Tommy returned to Nebraska, where he married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and ran a successful farming operation for 43 years. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did, he always emphasized the courage of his fellow soldiers rather than his own actions. It wasn't until his grandson began researching the family's military history that the full scope of Tommy's achievement began to be understood. The church tower where SS Oberfuhrer Zimmermann met his end still stands today, now serving as a memorial to all those who fought in the Battle of the Vosges Mountains. A small plaque, installed by the French government in 1994, commemorates the actions of the American 3rd Battalion and specifically mentions the impossible shot that turned the tide of battle. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Tommy Sullivan's legacy isn't found on any memorial or in any history book. It's found in the simple fact that 230 American soldiers went home to their families after the war. Soldiers who might have spent years in German prisoner-of-war camps, if not for one quiet farm boy who knew how to make an impossible shot when it mattered most. The story of that October morning in 1944 reminds us that heroism often comes from the most unexpected places, that the skills learned in peaceful pursuits can sometimes save lives in the most desperate circumstances, and that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to a single moment of perfect execution under impossible pressure. Tommy Sullivan passed away in 2009 at the age of 87, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who knew him as a gentle man who loved the land and taught them to respect the power of patience and precision. His Springfield rifle hangs above the mantelpiece in his grandson's home in Lincoln, Nebraska, a quiet reminder of the day when one shot changed the course of history and proved that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible becomes inevitable in the hands of someone who refuses to give up.